Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Welcome to Handmade History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Alicia.
And I'm Sonia.
And today we are talking about Harriet Powers and her quilts. But first, this episode is sponsored by Quiltfolk. What if you could travel the country without leaving your sewing room? Quiltfolk is a quarterly, print-only magazine that celebrates quilt history and quilt culture. Each issue takes you to a different state, sharing the stories of quilters, shop owners, designers, historians, and makers, the people behind the stitches. With 164 pages of beautiful photography and thoughtful storytelling, and absolutely no advertisements, Quiltfolk is slow reading you can savor. It's a chance to slow down, feel connected, and be inspired by the craft we love. Travel stitch by stitch with Quiltfolk, wherever you like to read or sew. Get 20% off your first order now with coupon code HANDMADEHISTORY. Thank you, Quiltfolk.
And a quick reminder, pre-orders are closing tomorrow for our first ever collaboration kit, the Wild Pansy Stump Work Stitch Along. Melissa Galbraith of M Creative J designed this beautiful pattern and kit. Starting March 3rd, we are going to stitch it up together and learn about stump work. We will post our progress each week on social media and on our Patreon page. If you would like to join us, you can pre-order the kit or PDF pattern at the link in our show notes.
And now, on to the show. This week's topic was inspired by the USPS. They are releasing a set of 4 stamps in 2026 based on Harriet Powers' Pictorial Quilt. And at the time of recording, we don't know exactly when they will be coming out. But I'm pretty excited. You can see them online. And this episode is also our first quilt-related episode, which is hard to believe.
Mm-hmm.
Sonia, want to kick us off?
So Harriet Powers was a quilter and artist who lived in the late 1800s. 2 of her quilts, the Pictorial Quilt and Bible Quilt, survive and are held in museums. The Pictorial Quilt is at the MFA in Boston, and the Bible Quilt is at the National Museum of American History, a Smithsonian museum in Washington, D.C. Powers was born on a plantation in Athens, Georgia on October 29, 1837. We don't know her maiden name. And John and Nancy Lester owned the plantation. Powers was born into slavery, and she likely learned to sew as a child. At age 18, she married Armistead Powers, who was also enslaved. Their great-great-granddaughter, Elise Minter, is a genealogist and librarian at the Library of Congress who researched them. She said that Armistead would sneak out to visit Harriet while he was still enslaved, risking punishment. Together, Harriet and Armistead had 9 children, and they were emancipated after the Civil War with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in 1865.
The Powers became farmers. They bought land in Georgia. Elise Minter found an interview with one of their sons, which was part of the Works Progress Administration, who said that Armistead had a, quote, very sharp mind when it came to making money. It is likely that Harriet Powers was illiterate. She made at least 5 quilts and passed away on January 1st, 1910. Powers' obituary was in the local paper, which was remarkable for this time. Most Black people's obituaries were in Black newspapers only. Her grave was lost over the years, but her work was rediscovered in the 1970s. And in 2023, the Women of Color Quilters Network organized a committal ceremony and put a new gravestone at the Powers grave sites at Gospel Pilgrim Cemetery in Athens. The front of the grave shows Armistead and Harriet's dates of birth and death, and the back shows Harriet and 2 panels from her quilts. It says, Bible reader, museum collected, extraordinary storyteller and quilter, we salute you.
Harriet Powers' quilts are unique in that they tell stories. She made them using applique and piecing. Both the Pictorial Quilt and the Bible Quilt are made up of panels, and each panel is a scene, and each scene tells a story. The scenes in the Bible Quilt all come from the Bible, and the ones in the Pictorial Quilt are a mix of Bible stories and true events, including some that happened before Powers was born. For example, one panel depicts the Leonid meteor shower, which happened in 1833. A blog post about the quilt's enduring legacy on JSTOR called the quilts, quote, an exemplar of the influence and power of women's domestic art and art inspired by traditions outside the Western canon. Teresa Doria Wong, writing for Quiltfolk magazine, called them, quote, priceless treasures of American art. And Leslie King Hammond, writing in Aware, a website that profiles women in art, wrote that Powers, quote, has visualized monumental artistic vision and storytelling. She also wrote that Powers used quilting as a means to express her artistic intent, intellect, and agency. And finally, King Hammond said, these two quilts remain as critical, unparalleled examples of works executed by a woman of African descent, telling her stories of her very real African American experiences that are crucial to a more authentic narrative of the whole history of America's past, present, and future through the artistry of textile creations.
Yeah, so these quilts are really interesting and they're very beautiful. And we'll talk more about what they look like in a minute. But first, we're going to share how the quilts came to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and to the National Museum of American History. So Powers showed the Bible quilt at the Athens Cotton Fair in 1886. It's kind of like a mini World's Fair, Sonia. It's like farm fair, yeah.
Yeah.
A local white woman, Jenny Smith, who was a teacher, saw this quilt and immediately wanted to buy it. And we know this story from Smith's letters. Smith wrote that Powers told her the quilt was, quote, not for sale at any price. Elise Minter, the descendant, genealogist, and librarian we mentioned above, said, quote, the way that Jenny Smith talked about the quilt, it was obvious it was fascinating to her and that she admired the work that my great-great-great-grandmother did. But she didn't look at Harriet Powers as being the same as her. It was like, for a Black person to have created something like this, it was remarkable. And it was through that lens that she wanted to own it. A few years after the fair, Harriet and Armistead Powers brought the quilt to Smith, and Smith wrote that Harriet had wrapped the quilt in a, quote, clean flour sack, which was still further enveloped in a crocus sack. The Powers asked her for $10 for it, which is about $350 today. Smith bargained them down to $5, or about $175 in today's money. When Powers sold the quilt to Smith, she dictated a description of each panel, which Smith wrote down. Elise Minter also said, quote, I feel like the way that this story is told and the fact that we only have Jenny Smith's word to rely on kind of takes away some of the agency from Harriet Powers and what she intended in terms of her creation. And Minter pointed out that Powers intended this quilt to be a family heirloom.
Smith displayed the Bible quilt at the 1885 Cotton States and International Exposition at the Negro Pavilion. At that time, Negro was a polite word for Black folks, and we use it here in that context. Well, we want to be polite and respectful. A group of women whose husbands were professors at Atlanta University saw the quilt and commissioned Harriet Powers to make another quilt for them. This was the Pictorial Quilt. The women gave this quilt as a thank you gift to Dr. Charles Cuthbert Hall, a minister who had helped start Atlanta University. The Halls kept it in their family for 62 years, and Dr. Hall's son sold it to Maxim Karolek, who bequeathed it to the MFA in 1964. Jenny Smith bequeathed the Bible quilt to the Smithsonian, along with Harriet Powers' description of each panel.
And the USPS stamps come from the Pictorial Quilt. Derry Noyes, the art director at USPS, chose the panels to make into stamps. Noyes has worked at USPS for 40 years and designed almost 800 stamps and stamp products. And Noyes chose panels 2, 13, 8, and 14 for the stamps. Here is Harriet Powers' description of each of those panels. Panel 2, the dark day of May 19th, 1780. The 7 stars were seen at 12 N in the day, meaning 12 noon. The cattle all went to bed, chickens to roost, and the trumpet was blown. The sun went off to a small spot and then to darkness. Panel 13. Rich people who were taught nothing of God. Bob Johnson and Kate Bell of Virginia. They told their parents to stop the clock at 1, and tomorrow it would strike 1, and so it did. This was the signal that they had entered everlasting punishment. The independent hog, which ran 500 miles from Georgia to Virginia, her name was Betts. Panel 8, the falling of the stars on November 13th, 1883. The people were frightened and thought that the end had come. God's hand stayed the stars. The varmints rushed out of their beds. Panel 14, the creation of animals continues.
Panel 2, When Stars Could Be Seen at Noon, describes the dark day of 1780. This was not a solar eclipse. In fact, it is unclear what turned the sky dark that day. It happened in New England and parts of Canada. Powers grew up in Georgia more than 100 years later, so clearly this remained a famous historical event. Researchers think that the sun was covered by ash and smoke from forest fires, which sounds terrifying.
Yes, I agree.
Panel 8 describes the Leonid meteor shower, which we mentioned earlier. This happened 4 years before Powers was born. Panel 13 seems to be a morality tale. It's interesting that there is a pig associated with the, quote, rich people in the panel. We'll talk more about that later. Panel 14 is a story from the Bible about the creation of the world.
There's a brief sidetrack that I thought we would take because we mentioned Charles Hall and Atlanta University, and Harriet Powers made the Pictorial Quilt as a gift for Charles Hall. So, like I said, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but I found the story of the organization that founded Atlanta University interesting, so I thought we would share it here. So Atlanta University was founded in 1865 by the American Missionary Association. Atlanta University is an HBCU, or an historically Black college university. It was the first university in the country to award graduate degrees to Black students. And later it combined with Clark College to become Clark Atlanta University, which is what it is called today. And the American Missionary Association was an abolitionist organization of white folks. They formed in 1846 and founded hundreds of schools for Black people. Some of the founders met while raising funds for the defense of the Amistad captives. And if you haven't heard this story, the Amistad was a ship that sailed from Sierra Leone in Africa to Havana, Cuba, carrying 49 men and 4 boys to be sold into slavery. However, en route from Havana to another city in Cuba, the men captured the ship and sailed to New York. And they were put on trial when they docked. Eventually, they were declared free. And in the wake of this trial, a group called the American Board Commissioners for Foreign Missions split off into several groups, including the Union Missionary Society, the Western Evangelical Missionary Society, and the Committee for West Indians Missions. These groups broke off because the American Board refused to adopt, quote, Christian abolitionist principles. And eventually, the 3 smaller groups became the American Missionary Organization.
The AMA began by paying teachers in Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. They followed the Union Army as it went through the South during the Civil War. After the Union confiscated buildings, the AMA set up schools in them. They chartered the first teacher training schools, which were called normal schools at the time, for Black people. They chartered Berea College, which we have an episode about, which is episode 7. And by 1879, more than 150,000 students were taught by graduates of AMA-funded normal schools. These schools educated more than 7,000 teachers. Lester Sullivan wrote in an article that the AMA wanted to, quote, demonstrate conclusively that African Americans were capable of mastering higher education and provide African American leaders who might assist their people in the struggle for equal rights.
Yeah, and I just found this organization very inspiring. After the messy split of an older, more prestigious organization, it then coalesced into a group that had a major impact on Black education.
Yeah, I didn't know that history at all.
Yeah, I became curious about who that Dr. Hall was, and that's how I found this rabbit hole. So yeah. So moving on, we'll go back to Harriet Powers quilts now. We're going to talk more about applique and piecing and what these quilts actually look like. And you can also see photos on our Patreon post for this episode, and you can also just search it up. Or buy the stamps. They're very pretty whenever they come out. So the fabric in both quilts, in both the Bible and the Pictorial Quilt, is cotton fabric. Harriet Powers used cotton to piece the front, for the back, and for the batting in between. Color-wise, the Bible quilt includes a palette of blue-gray, orange, black, tan and light tan, brown, red, and a gray and white calico print. There's also a really pretty print with brown stripes on a white background, and she uses this for circles in her quilt. The panels of the Bible quilt are divided by light tan strips, and there are orange squares at the panel corners. The panels are rectangular or square, and they are not all the same size. Powers appliqued figures, including humans and animals, as well as geometric shapes in each of the scenes. And some interesting features. The animals have one eye each, and they are often in profile. The humans, including the figure of Jesus, do not have faces. Jesus and other holy figures have halos, which are pieced out of tiny triangles. And Jesus has red circles to represent blood. There are also symbols in the open space between figures in some of the panels, and there are X's and circles with triangle-pieced borders. One of my favorite panels of the Bible quilt was of Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. The panel shows Judas surrounded by coins made of gold cloth and a figure that might be a serpent at the bottom. Powers quilted the quilt by hand, and she used intersecting lines that make organic geometric shapes, including triangles or asterisks. And the Pictorial Quilt has more high contrast colors, and this may be because it is less faded.
The aesthetic of Powers quilts is connected to quilting tradition in West Africa, especially the Dahomey and Fon traditions. The Fon are an ethnic group associated with the Kingdom of Dahomey. The Kingdom of Dahomey was a medieval empire. It became a center of the international slave trade in the 1700s and 1800s. Dahomey became independent in 1975. Now it is Benin. The Fon are traditionally from Tado, which is a city in Togo. According to an article from the Met, quote, the Fon kings were important art patrons who engaged court artists to create items that enhanced their status. These artworks might be sculptures or textiles. They would parade these artworks through the capital at annual festivals called Hutanu. Because of the slave trade, Dahomey was almost constantly at war to raid and capture people. This created a culture of militarism that focused on a king. The Fon created metal sculptures of animals that were filled with, quote, supernaturally potent materials that would protect the king.
The Fon also used a system of divination called Fa. Fa contained 256 symbols. Each ruler was associated with one of the symbols, including animals. Quote, a ruler was so intimately allied with his emblem that it was believed he could assume that animal's form. Proverbs, poems, and songs are used to interpret each sign in corresponding visual arts. And as an example, two rulers, King Gueso and his son, King Glele, who ruled in the 1800s, were both associated with the elephant. The elephant evokes strength, royal legacy, and enduring memory. Proverbs associated with the elephant in this tradition include, there where the elephant passes in the forest, one knows, and the animal steps on the ground, but the elephant stepped down with strength. And a Fon artist created a silver elephant for these rulers.
Fon or Dahomey applique textiles also reflect the Fa system. They were and are made on commission, and they often reflect specific events. They also depict kings, chiefs, and warriors. Traditionally, they are done by men. Historically, applique artists used cloth imported from Europe. Now they use cloth made in Africa. Applique was used to make banners, hats, hammocks, pillow tops, wall hangings, and fancy state umbrellas. Elliot Alyssa Fon photographed applique artists in the city of Dahomey, Benin in 1970 to 1971. He observed Fon men and boys working, and noted that they, quote, transmit patterns for designs from one generation to the next. We saw something similar in the tallados or family guilds that make papel picado in Mexico. Today, Dahomey applique is a popular tourist item. We've included an image of a Dahomey applique wall hanging in our Patreon blog post.
Powers quilts reflect the Dahomey aesthetic. When you look at them, you can see a similar approach to quilting. The panel, for example, with the rich people who are not taught about the Bible also includes a pig that runs away. Having a person and an animal in the same panel could possibly reflect a worldview that includes the Fa system or something similar. It seems as though the animal means something or reflects something about the people or the story that Powers shared in her description. Leslie King Hammond writes that Powers, quote, likely learned her craft from enslaved Africans who came to the Americas with generations of technical knowledge and complex aesthetic traditions embedded in their memories. We don't know if Powers' ancestors are from Benin or a different country in Africa. And of course, it's difficult to think about aesthetic or craft-related innovations or shifts that happen because of slavery. It goes without saying that this was a horrible chapter of American history. However, it's clear that slavery and the forced migration of so many different people changed textile and art history.
So next we have a strange chapter to share about Powers quilts. In 1992, the Smithsonian tried to sell reproductions of the Bible quilt, along with a few other quilts from the mid-1800s from their collection. These included the Album Quilt by Eliza Jane Bale, the Sunburst Quilt by Anna Sophia Shriver, and the Great Seal of the United States by Susan Strong. The National Museum of American History signed a contract with American Pacific Enterprises to manufacture these quilts overseas. They sold them for about $150 to $200 in their gift shop, which is about $350 to $450 today. The quilts included a certificate that said the quilt was an authentic Smithsonian reproduction. Many American quilters did not like this. Over 25,000 quilters signed 500 petitions in quilt shops around the country, and they did a fax attack where they faxed their elected officials. Dozens of quilters went to the National Museum to protest on March 1st, 1992, and they were upset for a few reasons. They did not like the devaluing of quilts. Quilters sold handmade quilts in the museum gift shop that cost $1,000 or more, and these reproductions devalued their work. They also didn't like that the quilts were made overseas, in particular in China. The current Senator of Tennessee, Al Gore, even commented on the situation, saying, quote, "There is a great irony and insensitivity in the Smithsonian's decision to have Chinese workers reproduce classic American quilts."
And this issue is more complicated than perhaps it seems. I think Al Gore's phrase, Chinese workers, is demeaning and reflects an attitude toward China and Chinese people that some people had at this time. This attitude, which is that Chinese people are in some way lesser than Americans, may have accounted for some of the outrage that quilters felt at the time. The idea of a classic American quilt is also complicated and interesting. We know from many episodes on here that crafts very frequently travel to new places and morph as different groups of people with different tools, materials, aesthetics, and experiences make them.
On April 10, 1992, representatives of the quilt community met with the Smithsonian officials, including Roger Kennedy, the director of the museum. The museum agreed to not renew their contract with American Pacific. They also added a label to each reproduction quilt saying that it had been made in China. The Quilt Alliance, an organization that is still around today, was formed through this incident by Carrie Bresaham, Nancy O'Brien, Eunice Ray, and Shelley Zagar. They also created the Quilt Index, an online database that is housed at Michigan State Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences. The Smithsonian also took a suggestion from the quilters and made reproductions of some of the fabrics that were in their collection. The collection is called Rising Sun, and it included 39 fabrics. It was manufactured by RJR Fabrics, a fabric wholesaler in California.
Harriet Powers' legacy remains powerful. In addition to being a stamp, people make their own handmade reproductions of her quilt as a way to pay homage to her work. In fact, the Princeton Sankofa Stitcher Modern Quilt Guild did this and were featured in Quiltfolk 29, all about New Jersey. Her work is also the subject of numerous academic papers, articles, and books. And that is Harriet Powers and her quilts. Sonia, what do you think?
As always, that was very interesting. I didn't know any of the history of that one. I haven't seen her quilts, which I've been to the MFA. So now we have yet another museum we have to go see.
Yes. We need to take a field trip.
Yeah.
I have seen the one at the MFA. It's pretty amazing.
I think it's so cool that her great-great-granddaughter is like a genealogist and researcher.
Yes.
And like is able to really like study that work. That's really cool.
I know. And she happened to become a librarian at the Library of Congress. Yeah. Pretty cool.
And like the quilt ended up like, one of the quilts ended up like not that far then.
Yeah. She actually, the article that I read where she was quoted, she didn't realize that her great-great-grandmother's quilts were like just not very far from where she lived.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's fun.
I also really enjoyed the fax attack. I think it's really a bummer that we can't protest that way anymore. I would really love
90s.
What's that?
Yeah. I said it's so 90s.
And also, can you just imagine, like, I'm just imagining a fax machine just like spitting out paper after paper, fax after fax.
Yeah. Genius.
Thank you so much for listening. Check out our blog post for this episode at patreon.com/handmadehistorypodcast. You'll see photos of both of Harriet Powers' quilts along with Dahomey applique and links to learn more about what we talked about here today. Thanks also to Quiltfolk for sponsoring this episode. Use code HandmadeHistory for 20% off your first order on quiltfolk.com.
If you have a question or comment, you can email us at handmadehistoryhosts, HOSTS@gmail.com, or visit our website at handmadehistorypodcast.com. Bye.
Bye.
Powers' quilts along with, oh man, I said Powers' for the first time.
Oh my God.
Oh my God. Okay. All right.